In this episode of Miniature Landscape Hobbies, I'm going to show you how I got to this from this. This terrain is a 2 foot by 4 foot board section made of insulation foam glued to 3/4 inch plywood that I made about 15 years ago, maybe actually a little more. Originally, it was part of an entire 6 foot by 4 foot table I was asked to make when Games Workshop first came out with the Lord of the Rings games. Over time, the board has been used as a display. One of its sections was used by my son to build a World War I diorama that's still at the local high school now. And over time, all of the scattered terrain I built to go on top of it has either been reused or sold with commissions. As a result, this is all that is left. And it's in bad shape. It's badly chipped, whole sections of the plaster are missing, and is generally worn out after being used from games ranging from Warhammer Fantasy Battle to Flames of War. Oh yeah, and we need a new bridge too. The original one was all covered in medieval paraphernalia. Now, here, the river's good, so we're going to keep that. Let's get to work. So here I have some regular painter's tape. It'll stick to the surface of the resin just fine. And we're just going to stick it down and cover up the resin so we don't get any paint on it, scratch it, anything like that. Alright, it's all covered up now. With that done, we can move on to the next step, and we grab some scissors, a marker, a ruler, a knife, and some of these big rolls of sandpaper, and lay them down over the road section, decide how long we want them to be, and then we just cut them. This stuff is really good for making roads. It has a nice, interesting texture. It's not expensive, and it comes in flat sheets. It also happens to be just about the perfect width for forming roads for Flames of War or Team Yankee, anything in 15mm. So we follow up by pouring some craft glue. And we add some water to it. So I mix it up, put it on a big old brush, something that's not good quality, and spread it over the section I want to do. Put the road in place over top of it, and push it down. It's not going to fit on its own. This stuff curls up a bit. So what I do is once I've got it pressed down, I'll grab some thumbtacks or push pins, and I just put them in place. I don't skimp on them, I use lots, and I just push them down the sides of the road to hold it flat. So here we go, we've got that done. Then from here, I put some old glue bottles and paint bottles on the top of the paper just to hold it down to make sure it dries extra flat. And with this done, we're done for the evening. So it's the next morning, and I remove the paint bottles, and I also remove the tacks. Then I go and get my ruler and a knife, and I measure out where I want the bridge embankment to go. About 9.5 to 10 centimeters wide, and about 6 to 8 centimeters deep into the bank, just deep enough to sink the bridge in. I grab a sheet of cardboard and cut out some 2-centimeter strips. I'm going to use these to put banks along the road. Then I glue those down with hot glue, and I seal them down with some masking tape. I go ahead and press the masking tape into the sides, And then with that done, I move on to making debris for the road. So I get a whole bunch of miscellaneous stuff, some strips of basswood, some pieces of styrofoam, some matchsticks, and some plastic lattice here too. And grabbing my craft knife, first I take the styrofoam and I just cut it up into odd chunks. I carve some grooves and marks into it, as this will make rocks and crumbled masonry on the road and along the sides of the road. Grabbing matchsticks, I break them up into little pieces. Sometimes I cut them, sometimes I use my fingers, and I have jagged ends on some of them. And then a couple pieces of this plastic lattice. I just like the shape. I crumple it up into weird little shapes. And cut some of this basswood strips into flat boards, and I break the ends and leave them ragged. It won't really be in scale necessarily for the 15mm models, but it'll still look good and add some interest. Now I take my hot glue gun and I glue down the styrofoam for the rocks and any of the other pieces. I try to keep them kind of random. And now here's a gap between a couple pieces of the sandpaper, so I glue some sticks down over top of that just to hide the gap a little bit. This is a good time at which you can correct some of your errors. Now I move on to one of the really major steps, and that's putting the grit down on the surface. So I mix up some craft glue with some water. And I grab the rest of my tools, so several old paintbrushes, something ratty that you don't mind getting damaged. And using a big broad one, I mix up the glue and the water until it's kind of a paste. I don't want it too thick. I want to be able to brush it, but I still want it to go down fairly easily. And I just begin working in sections, spreading it out, avoiding the road mainly, putting a few little patches on. And I glue usually a quarter of the board at a time, then grabbing a mix of 80% sandbox sand to 20% kitty litter. I just go ahead and sprinkle it in, and I work my way over really the whole model. I like to get little patches here and there on the road to build some interest, and I rely on the tape over the river to keep it safe. Then I grab 2 squirt bottles. One is full of 50% rubbing alcohol, 50% water, and the other one is full of about 80% water and about 20% white glue. Then I layer down the rubbing alcohol water mixture thinly over the surface of the whole model and follow up by doing a big spray of the white glue and water mixture and just drench it over top of everything. The rubbing alcohol helps the white glue flow in between the different grains of sand and kitty litter and helps it get in there so it can dry. Then with that done, I leave this to dry. I leave it alone for at least 24 hours. Now I get ready to build the bridge, and I start by finding a 3D printable file for some railings. And while those are printing, I go ahead and I cut out a 20 centimeter by 10 centimeter wide strip of foam core to form the top of the bridge, which I then follow by cutting 2 strips of foam core, each about 3 centimeters high and 20 centimeters long, to form the edges of the bridge. Using the edge of my palette and a pen, I just draw out an arch somewhere about the middle of the bridge. And I do it on both sides, and then I cut them out with my craft knife so there's a spot for the water to flow under the bridge. And from there, I take everything and I throw it in a tub of water, and I leave it to soak for about 10 minutes. Now I cut some strips of basswood out, 2 strips about 1.5 centimeters tall and about 10 centimeters long, and I cut some 45-degree angle corners to go on the sides, 4 of them, and these will form planters to go on the sides of the bridge. Then I go back to my foam core, which has been soaking, and using my fingers I peel back the paper coating on the outside on one side of each of the strips and expose the gray foam underneath. After the foam has had some time to dry, I take out a pen and I start scoring a stone pattern into the sides. I apply enough pressure to make a deep groove around each stone pattern and work in some texture into the edges of the bridge. Now going to the top of the bridge, I take my ruler and I rule out a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter grid on the top. And I score fairly deeply into the foam to create the impression of there being stone tiles on the bridge. I go to my 3D printer, enough time has passed for the models to have printed and drained, and I pull them off the build plate, so I now have railings for my bridge. And I go back to my bridge, and I cut out some filler strips from Styrofoam and Extra Foam Core Cutoff. These are about 8.5 centimeters long, just wide enough to fit between the halves of the bridge when they're glued to the top. And I flip the bridge over, measure it all up, and run a bead of hot glue along the top of the bridge on one side. I place the bridge section carefully, and try to center it up as best as I can. And then I do the same thing on the other side. Running in my hot glue, placing the bridge side. I try to keep it square and even, but the center guides help with that. Then I use hot glue to glue the center guides in place, and since they're roughly the width of the bridge with the wall subtracted, they fit fine. I take a 1/2 centimeter wide strip of basswood and glue down the sections of railing to it in a neat row, which produces 2 sides. And I also finish my flower planters by super gluing the 45-degree angle cutoffs to the sides of the basswood strip, and I put some foam core cutoffs in the back too. And I go back and grab the bridge. I grab the planters. I decide to put them just above the archway. I apply some hot glue. Do it on both sides, of course. On the bottom of the basswood strips, I also adhere the bridge railings to the side of the bridge. The bridge is now complete except for painting. So I grab my airbrush and loading it with some black spray primer, I prime the whole thing. And leave it to dry. So now about 24 hours have gone by and the texture has dried on the board section. So I take it out to the garage and laying down some cardboard, I knock the excess grit off and then lay it down and apply some masking tape around the edges and around anywhere I see exposed foam, such as inside the river banks. Then I apply 2 coats of black matte spray paint, and after this dries, I go over it with 2 coats of matte spray varnish. Then I leave it to dry for a couple hours. I take it back inside, put it on my workbench, take off the masking tape from around the sides, and I set out some dark brown acrylic paint. Now I hope you like dry brushing, because there's about to be a lot of dry brushing. I grab my ratty brush again, wipe a good portion of the paint off. You don't need to make it completely dry in this case. And I begin lightly flicking the brush back and forth across the surface and putting that brown paint on the raised texture. Following this, I move to increasingly lighter colors with some tan colors, Again, highlighting all the earth areas on the board. Another lighter color. Then I switch to a dark gray on the roads. I also get a finer brush and I put it on some of the larger rocks. Move on to a light gray and put that on the roads and the rocks. I put down kind of an off-white and I put it over everything. This unifies the earth tones and the gray together, and I hit pretty well the entire model with it. And there you have it. The whole board section has been dry brushed. Taking out my airbrush, I put some yellowish paint in it, some light yellow, and I work it into the road just to increase some visual interest in terms of colors. I also put a couple layers of a lighter tan in, and then I grab some brown paint, paint the wood sections, and using black acrylic ink, draw shadows in around some of the larger pieces of debris and along the roadsides. With that, most of the work on texturing the model itself is done, so we can remove the tape from the river, and we can get the nice colors in the river back. And while that dries, we move to the bridge. And we do the same pattern as we did on the roads, dry brushing dark grays to light grays, then a final dry brush of white. Using acrylic ink, we go over the gaps between the stone slabs, and we paint the planters a light gray and then wash it with a dark brown. And I also take a watered down green paint and paint it along the bottoms of the bridge where it would overlap with the water. Now I use some white glue to fix some twigs and some model icons in place in the flower box. This helps add some color to the model. I follow up by spraying the bridge down with a coat of matte varnish from my airbrush. This is to seal the paint in and to add some extra protection to the bridge. While the varnish dries, I go ahead and make a whole bunch of clumps of grass. If you're curious about how to do this, I have a separate video on this. I'll put a link in the description below. Now the varnish is dry, so I run a couple beads of hot glue along the bottom of the bridge, and I simply just press it into place. Here I notice that there are some slight gaps between the edge of the bridge and the rest of the board, so I fill these in with shims I make out of insulation foam, and I paint these over with some white glue. While I'm at it, I put a few dots of white glue elsewhere on the bridge so I can sprinkle them with some texture. As that glue dries, I take out my hot glue gun and I glue down some lichens in various spots on the board. And I take my grass I made previously, and using a pin vise, I drill a hole in the board and push the grass into place after dipping it in a little bit of white glue. At this point, I'm getting pretty excited because we're getting near the end of the project. So I take some watered down white glue and apply it in patches to the board. Grab my static grass applicator and I load it with different types of grass. Some spots I mix, other spots I use only one color, and I put down static grass patches at random just to add a little bit of visual interest to how the board is designed. And finally, I take a brush and I brush some of the brown, tan, and off-white tones into the grit around the bridge, and we're finished. And here is the big reveal. Though I designed this board for wargaming, I think you'll agree that it would work just as well for display purposes or as a diorama. I always like to try to build my terrain to as high a standard as possible. That way, I'm always challenging myself as an artist. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making this project. If you have any interesting terrain builds you'd like to tell us about, please put them in the comments below. Also, please remember to subscribe to my channel and press the bell button to receive notifications. You don't want to miss out on any new videos. Lastly, Miniature Landscape Hobbies now has a Patreon account. You can find us at www.patreon.com/miniaturelandscapehobbies. The link to this is also in the video description. If you want to help me make more content, please consider making a one-time donation or starting a subscription. Until next time, continue to build life in miniature.